Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar, So You Want to Be a Preservationist. It's part of our 2025 Preserve the Past, Build for the Future webinar series. We're recording this session and it will be made available later on our YouTube channel. Also, if you need closed captioning, please click on the caption button. Hi, I'm Lynn Richmond. I am the Acting Director of the Office of Communications, Education and Outreach at the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. There is a great need to bring a new and diverse workforce to the field of cultural resources management. One of our goals is to show young people the many ways they can use their degrees when entering our field. We have assembled a panel today with wide-ranging experience. We hope they inspire you on your career journeys. Just a quick word about the ACHP. The ACHP is an independent federal agency that promotes the economic, educational, environmental, and cultural values of historic preservation and advises the President and Congress on national historic preservation policy. The ACHP also influences federal activities, programs, and policies that affect historic and cultural properties. The ACHP is comprised of 24 statutory members and is the only federal agency whose sole mission is historic preservation. A large part of the ACHP's work is overseeing Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, which requires federal agencies and those receiving federal funding or federal licensure to consider historic preservation when carrying out an undertaking. This webinar series fulfills several aspects of our mission: to educate the public about historic preservation, bring young people into the field, and build a more inclusive preservation program. We have a great lineup this year for Preserve the Past, Build for the Future. All webinars start at 2 p.m. Eastern Time and last an hour and 15 minutes. Coming up on Tuesday, February 25th, is Preserving Historic Black Business Districts. On Wednesday, March 26th, is Missing the Blues, Black Music and Saving Its Houses Across America. On Tuesday, April 22nd, join us for Disappearing Places, Protecting Latino Hispanic History from Erasure. And our final webinar in the series will be Wednesday, May 21st, History Underwater, Preserving the Undersea Heritage. You can register for all these on our webinar page. We will be putting that link in the chat. Also, you can find the recordings of our past year's webinars at that same link. And we've been doing this since 2021, so we have quite a few wonderful webinars to check out. I am very excited about today's guests. They are Jessie Barrington. She is an attorney at law, cultural heritage partners, and she specializes in Indian law and tribal policy. Tyriq Charleus, he's a historic preservation planner at the Commission for Historical and Architectural Preservation for the City of Baltimore. Hi. And Amber Wiley, Associate Professor of Planning, Landscape Architecture and Design, and Wick, Cary Director of the Institute for Quality Communities, Christopher C. Gibbs College of Architecture at the University of Oklahoma. Welcome, everyone. Before we begin, if you have any questions at all during this webinar, please put them in the chat box. Once the speakers have given their presentations, we'll call on you to pose your questions to our panelists. We'll put you on audio and you can ask those questions yourself. So now we're going to begin with Jessie. Jessie, welcome.
Thank you, Lynn, and I would just like to thank you for inviting me to the panel. So really excited to be here today. And so I'm going to share my screen here and do a quick presentation and overview of kind of like my work. And, you know, I'm so used to giving presentations on all types of topics, but one about myself is a little bit more nerve-wracking. So I just appreciate everyone's patience with me. So again, hello. So my name is Jessie Barrington. I am an attorney with Cultural Heritage Partners, which is located in Richmond, Virginia. and just kind of go through a little bit of my background. Oh, there we go. Okay. So to start with here, a little bit about my background. So I am an enrolled citizen of the Confederated tribes of Coos, Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians. And that is one of Oregon's 9 federally recognized tribes. I graduated from Lewis and Clark Law School, which is located in Portland, Oregon. And while Lewis and Clark didn't have a focus on Indian law, I took as many courses as I could on Indian law and tribal law, and then just kind of built my career from there. I've had a number of positions since graduating almost 12 years ago, which is kind of crazy. And they've kind of ranged from working in a law firm for about 1.5 years with a law firm that focuses primarily on Indian law issues. And then I went to the solicitor's office in Portland, Oregon, which is the agency of attorneys that advise the Department of the Interior, which is one of the federal departments, and then was tapped to go back to DC and serve as a senior counselor to the Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs. And after that, I was a federal prosecutor at the U.S. Attorney's Office in the District of Oregon, and then spent a little bit of time as the executive director of the Western Resources Legal Center that runs out of Lewis and Clark Law School before my husband and I made the decision to move back to Virginia, which is where he is from, and was very fortunate to find Cultural Heritage Partners. And I'll tell you a little bit more about our work. I'm also an adjunct professor at Lewis and Clark Law School. I primarily focus on teaching federal Indian law and courses on oral advocacy and writing advocacy for tribal nations. So just a little bit about Cultural Heritage Partners. So we take on a number of matters that advance the principle of access to cultural heritage as a human right. So our firm is very unique because we are comprised of not just attorneys, but we have historians, tribal specialists, archaeologists, art scholars, and we serve clients globally. So our victories have strengthened international and federal preservation law, secured protection for important sites, objects, traditions. We really focus our tribal practice on affirmations of tribal sovereignty and First Nations people. We've also helped communities whose culture has been systematically devalued to be heard in the courts, legislature, and before international tribunals. So we take a holistic approach to the things that we focus on for our clients. So you might be asking yourself, why is legal advocacy critical for cultural heritage preservation? Well, when it comes to tribal issues, tribal nations are really focused right now on reclaiming ancestral land, resources, cultural materials, and ancestral remains. That is a key focus, although there are a lot of other things that the tribes work on. This seems to be the recurring focus for most of the tribal clients that we serve and that I've worked with in the past. Navigating complex tribal, federal, state, and local legal frameworks. If you know anything about federal Indian law, or if you are at all interested in law generally and just love complicated legal issues, then working for a tribe and working in federal or tribal law is definitely the area for you. It is complicated. The tribal, federal, state, and local rules kind of work, they overlap, and it all depends on factual circumstances, how they all kind of play out. Advocating for more legal frameworks to ensure sovereign rights of tribal nations, and advancing tribal sovereignty through the law includes cultural sovereignty. Preserving cultural heritage for future generations. And education is a humongous part of kind of why we do the work that we do. So the more people that we can educate about the sovereignty of tribes and tribal nations, I think is for the better. Addressing competing interests in preservation and development is also part of the legal advocacy work that we do. So you might ask yourself, what does the day-to-day work of an Indian law attorney look like? And, if you know any lawyers, if they're in your family or you have friends, they will, usually answer almost every question with, it depends. But, it can look like, at least for the work that we do, it can be advising tribal nations on governance issues, enterprise development, economic strategies. A lot of the work that tribal attorneys do are drafting tribal laws and resolutions, contracts, and other legal instruments that are not the same way that they are in all of the states, because one of the most important parts, particularly for things that may function outside of their, the tribal laws and resolutions, is ensuring that tribal sovereignty is reflected in contracts and other legal instruments. Assisting with reacquisition of ancestral land, particularly for tribes who have had their reservations diminished or disestablished altogether. Reacquisition is a huge component of reclaiming sovereignty. Engaging with federal and state agencies to facilitate on government-to-government relationships. Because tribes are sovereign entities, they are unique in our U.S. Federal system, in that the federal government and the state governments are expected to treat tribes as a sovereign and engage on a government-to-government relationship with them. And, they're not just entities that, they can kind of set aside or not listen to. A humongous part of that sovereignty is that the United States respects the tribe as a separate government, a government that, in many cases, entered into treaties with the United States. So other things that we work on, advising on real estate transactions, tax policy, and land and trust applications. And all of these activities together are critical to the tribe's ability to protect, sustain, and advance their cultural sovereignty. And, I think when I talk to people about Indian law and what that looks like, you have to be very dynamic. You have to understand kind of the overarching federal laws and policies that apply to tribes generally, to the tribes that you're advising, any state laws that may apply depending on where land is located or where certain activities are happening. And you have to, always be in a learning capacity because it's very hard to be an expert in all areas of federal Indian law. But it's definitely important to understand that your days could be very dynamic and you're always in a learning capacity. All right, so let's turn to some tips for aspiring cultural heritage advocates. I think that exploring foundational fields of historic preservation definitely gives the people that I've met a leg up. So law, anthropology, history, architecture, archaeology, museum, curation, etc. And then developing skills and pursuing opportunities. So, internships with organizations that align with your career goals, networking with professionals in the area of interest that you have. I want to add one thing here, which is just thinking about what you want to do and being true to yourself. So, if an organization you're really interested in doesn't have an externship, posted on their website, reach out to them. They may have opportunities for you to intern or extern with the organization, but they may just not have it up on their website. So, reaching out, having conversations, and in my experience, I think people are very generous with their time and helping folks kind of think about their career goals and where they want to go. So if there's something that you're interested in, definitely just look for those opportunities and don't feel worried about reaching out and potentially hearing no, because you might actually hear yes. And also think and understand the impact of your work. So advocacy when it comes to cultural heritage bridges law, policy, community engagement, education, to safeguard cultural artifacts, traditions, and historical sites for future generations. And this work is extremely meaningful and vital for maintaining cultural identity, fostering understanding, and promoting social cohesion. So meaningfully engage with the communities that you seek to positively impact. And even if you are in a new community and you want to just learn, from my experience and the advice that I give a lot of people is listen a lot more than you talk, because people will teach you, but I think that it's very important to have to always be in a posture of listening. I do that even though I'm this far along in my career. I am always sitting in a posture of wanting to learn and not needing to necessarily add anything to those conversations, but I just want to kind of be a sponge and learn about the communities that I serve. And so talking about pathways to historic preservation and cultural heritage law, there's a lot of different ways to get there. I don't think that there is one clear path, particularly if you are interested in law. So you could go to a law firm and you could get a ton of experience there and do litigation and then turn to kind of your passion project. But there are a lot of other paths that I think can be very meaningful and very helpful for understanding kind of how federal and state agencies work. So my advice would be, if you're interested in doing any kind of Indian law, I think it's extremely important to go and work for the feds to understand how those systems run, because that is probably the best education into figuring out how to advocate for your tribal clients when you're done. So the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Department of the Interior generally. So the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Solicitor's Office have a ton of attorneys that work there across the United States and in DC. We have the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, Departments of Historic Resources, National Park Service. If you are working for a federal agency, even the EPA or the Army, they're dealing with some of these issues too. And tribal concerns don't go away because you're not housed within Interior. There's nonprofit organizations, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, Southern Environmental Law Center, Native American Rights Fund. There are lots of organizations that focus on this type of work, and you can get fantastic experience working for those groups. And then there are kind of unicorns out there that focus on this type of work, such as Cultural Heritage Partners, that you can kind of do that meaningful work on the day-to-day for tribal clients and First Nations individuals. All right, so we have a link here. I think that the PowerPoints will be shared. So if you are interested in a legal career, we have a post about how to break into cultural heritage law. And that's the end of my presentation, but really looking forward to answering questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessie. So I will be posting the recording of the entire webinar on our YouTube channel, plus I will put relevant links. So if you want to share that link in the chat, I just take all the links and I put it in the description box on the YouTube video, so everybody can just click on those links.
All right, thank you, Lynn. I will definitely do that.
Thanks, Jessie. And we already have a couple of questions for you, so stay tuned. We'll check back with you after all the speakers. So now I'd like to call on Tyriq Charleus. So Tyriq is unique on this panel is in that he was an intern at the ACHP in a program called Preservation in Practice a few years ago. So Tyriq, I hope you'll talk a little bit about that and how your career has gone since then.
Okay, thanks for that intro. Hello, everyone. I am Tyriq Charleus. I'm the current city planner for CHAP, which is the Commission for Historical and Architectural Preservation for Baltimore City. I have a few districts within my under my belt that I issue permits for and do preservation work for. So my preservation journey, yes, did start Yes, it did start with the ACHP, a partnership with the ACHP, the National Park Service, and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. So I was a part of a program called Preservation in Practice. In this program, I was able to travel to Wyoming, to Grand Teton National Park, to get trained in the Secretary Standards for Historic Preservation. Here, I was able to restore log cabins, which were on dude ranches, to get hands-on experience. So I learned processes, earned methods like chinking and daubing to basically restore these log cabins. But the preservation work didn't stop there. After I was in Wyoming and was trained on the standards, I was also able to do hands-on preservation work at the Peel Center, which is one of the first museums in Baltimore City. And I was also able to restore the historic windows on the MSU chapel at the MSU chapel at Morgan State University. So this training and this hands-on experience within Baltimore City was very instrumental to me acquiring this job position currently. So yeah, with that being said, I'll give a little bit of my background. I am originally from Washington, D.C., so I did see a lot of historic properties and material be altered or be preserved while I went to school there. I did go to school for my architecture degree at Morgan State University. I received my bachelor's and my master's in architecture. However, that did not prevent me from entering in the preservation field. As you all know, I do currently work as a city planner, and I am currently teaching architectural freshmen as an adjunct professor at Morgan State University now. Right? So if you all are wondering what CHAP is, the Commission for Historical and Architectural Preservation was established in 1964 and is governed by Article 6 of the Baltimore City Code. Today, CHAP oversees 36 local historic districts, over 200 landmarks, and manages a local historic preservation tax program. CHAP helps preserve and revitalize neighborhoods, celebrates city history, and promotes historic preservation as a proven economic driver for Baltimore City. The mayoral appointed commission and its staff are located within the Department of Planning and are able to make decisions on projects that do not clearly meet the guidelines. CHAP also serves as a certified local government, and this means that basically our preservation program is in partnership with state and local and national governments to focus on promoting local historic preservation within the area. So that means our guidelines are also aligned with the guidelines at the national level. So it's often what's able to be approved at the local level can also be approved at the national level. This enables different people who participate in preservation to not only use the resources at the local level, but also at the state and the national level. Right. So our goal as a CHAP planner or a CHAP employee, our goal is to preserve historic preservation and monuments while also reclaiming broken neighborhoods and preventing the demolition by neglect and integrating our city's past in its future. So by doing so, some of the day-to-day responsibilities that I have are designating some of our historic fabric, our historic districts as historic and our landmarks as historic, reviewing plans within our locally designated districts to make sure they meet the guidelines. And we provide technical assistance and historical information to the public. So we're the first point of contact for anyone within the city that may have a question on preservation and how to undertake it. We also administer the Baltimore City Historic Restoration and Rehabilitation Tax Credit. So this is a 10-year tax credit that we offer to property owners who participate in renovating an abandoned historic property. It doesn't always have to be abandoned, but a historic site or property. So that basically freezes the tax value at the current tax value for the next 10 years, and you won't see an increase on the taxes for the next 10 years on the post renovation costs. We also conserve and maintain city-owned outdoor sculptures and monuments. We conduct historic research surveys with the community, of course. I've told you we all always comply with federal law to provide preservation recommendations for federal and state funded projects. And we integrate historic preservation recommendations into city and neighborhood plans. So moving into tips for aspiring historic preservationists, I would say getting hands-on experience on historic properties was very important to me. So not only was I able to understand the legal ways to renovate a property, going through the legal channels with the National Park Service, whether it's getting a grant from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, or using the ACHP to advocate for these initiatives. So getting the hands-on experience is also very important because you understand maybe the nitty-gritty that others may not understand in the challenges that may come along with renovating historic properties or historic sites. Getting to know the local resources were also very important. I had knowledge of, Baltimore City, some of its history, and the things that got preservation started within Baltimore City and why it's important and why it's needed. So this also helped me advocate for the job during the interview process. Then I would say pursue internships. There are many internships, whether they're offered by state, federal, or local entities that are maybe project specific or may just be recurring, job opportunities that people can take advantage of so they can have experience that they can speak to on their resume when it comes to pursuing jobs in the future. So as Jessie was saying, there are federal and state agencies that offer jobs. There's CHIP, there's also CHAP at the local level. There's the National Park Service. We often work with the National Trust, but there's also small entities within the city that pursue historic preservation practices, like the Southwest Partnership in Southwest Baltimore. Majority of their neighborhood is nationally designated. So having knowledge of historic preservation within those areas is very important because it's often historic preservation and the resources that are offered by these entities are utilized often to do large-scale projects or just simple renovations of someone's row home or home. There are also private firms and businesses. We work often with developers or even property owners who either are consultants who put together these applications and submit them to these organizations because the process can be a little daunting for property owners or for people who don't have any knowledge about historic preservation. So there's a large plethora of consultants who help facilitate the process for people. So whether you're going with a firm that's doing the developing or a consulting firm that puts all the pieces together and makes an application, you would still be participating in historic preservation. Having a property or a neighborhood or district designated as historic nationally may also be a daunting process, though often consultants are hired to facilitate this process because you have to define the boundaries of the neighborhood. You have to do the fact finding to make sure that these districts or properties are designated under the 4 criteria and that they're documented correctly. So that's what I have to speak on historic preservation at the local level for CHAP specifically. And if you have any additional questions on how you can get more involved in historic preservation, please contact me, especially if it's in Baltimore City. So I would like to say thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks, Tyriq. I think I was having a little trouble with my controls. It wasn't letting me come on immediately. I believe I might have set the settings to not allow people to share in the chat with everyone. So I am so sorry if that's the case. We are getting the messages that people put in the chat to the host and panelists, and I'll share those to with everyone. So anyway, thanks again to Tyriq. And next up is Amber Wiley. Amber, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. I am going to launch this PowerPoint when I can. Oh, here it is. I chuckled a bit when I thought about the title of this panel because this was never a question that I asked myself. So you want to be a preservationist? I don't know how many of us come into the field knowing that historic preservation is what we want to do. I certainly was not that person. Also, just to give a little background, this image here is me in San Diego with a National Historic Landmark that I was able to vote on, actually, as part of the National Park Service Advisory Board for National Historic Landmarks. So very exciting time. I'm from Oklahoma City. I recently moved back home, actually in November for the first time in 25 years. I'm currently at the University of Oklahoma. And I've often thought about what brought me to the preservation field. One thing I can say is that as a child, I moved 7 times before the age of 13, primarily in Oklahoma City. Here are just 4 of the places or the areas that I lived. My family was renting. Part of it was the instability of having parents who got divorced. And so it was part of that. But it also allowed me to experience a lot of different living conditions, shall we say, from a single family home to a condominium to an apartment building, 2-bedroom apartment for a family of 3, a lot of different things. Something else about moving around was how I would tell my friends how to get to the house. One of my favorite in the bottom left, and you see the Oklahoma State Capitol here, is you're heading up north on Lincoln Boulevard and you make a right at the oil derrick. That was something that we often said when folks were trying to find our house, because you would turn right at the oil derrick, which is just in front of the Capitol building. Another thing as I was growing up is that I often went to different cities with my parents when they were traveling for work. They were both dermatologists, and all the convention cities would host their conventions. And so I ended up visiting San Francisco as a child. My mother was born and raised in DC. And so we actually visited DC every summer, San Antonio, Las Vegas. And I always wondered what made these places so distinct. Why did they feel a certain way, like the atmosphere? It wasn't just the food, it was, the geography, all of those things. I kind of reveled in that. I really did. But art was my first love. These are a few drawings that I made in high school on the top. And I was torn between wanting to be an artist, but not wanting to be a starving artist, trying to figure out how you can apply that kind of aesthetic skill to a profession. And so I thought about architecture. Luckily, my public high school, Oklahoma Public High School, offered drafting and architectural drawing as part of our industrial zone, as they called it. The architecture class, you could see right into the shop. There was a glass window and you could look at folks doing woodworking and things of that nature. There were literally only 2 girls in the architecture class that I took in high school, but I learned how to make floor plans, do all the kinds of things that architects of the 1990s did. We messed around in CAD. We um, learned lettering, all those things. And so I figured I could go to college for architecture, but I was also still interested in the liberal arts. And I ended up moving across the country to Connecticut. I got my Bachelor of Arts in Architecture at Yale University. Is not a professional degree, it is a liberal arts degree. Went and got my Master's of Architectural History at the University of Virginia. It has one of the oldest architectural history programs, and in fact has a whole department dedicated to architectural history. I also got my Master's in Historic Preservation, or a certificate there, and then got a PhD in American Studies at George Washington. And I'll say about these three institutions, at Yale, it was an option that you could take a specialization track within the architecture major. Urban planning was a specialization, design was a specialization, and history, theory, and criticism was a specialization. I opted for history, theory, and criticism because I found our architectural history survey class to be fascinating. I was drawn into the notion of understanding society through its built environment. You can understand politics, religion, economics, geography, all these things. We looked at the pyramids and ancient temples and cathedrals, different ways of housing. And so it was the history that really inspired me. Plus, I really didn't like studio, if we're being fully honest. I did not like studio. And so it was there that I understood the notion of preservation as a field. And that's because of the mentors that I had. And I took these mentors with me everywhere I went. So Christy Anderson taught the Architectural History Survey course, and Catherine Lynn taught a graduate seminar in historic preservation. I didn't know until my junior year in college that historic preservation was a field. And it was because I took her graduate seminar. She came fishing for students in one of our larger architectural history classes and said, hey, preservation seminar, if you're interested, I'm teaching it. And that's when I understood that the love of history and the love of places could be applied. There's an actual application to that. Dale Upton was teaching at the University of Virginia, and his approach to thinking about the built environment was really inspirational to me, as was that of Richard Longstreth, who was a historian in the American Studies department at George Washington. These folks are academics, but they're also practitioners, and that was a model that I could see myself working in. So I am a professor, first and foremost, and I'll say that my academic training from architecture to architectural history and historic preservation to American studies kept getting broader and broader and broader. That's because I realized that even in architecture school, folks had a hard time discussing societal trends and how to really interact with the people. My interest in the people came from the stories that my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, and my paternal aunt told me. Here you see my grandfather in the Ride at the March on Washington, at his house in Letroit Park. My aunt, her graduation photograph from high school in Muskogee, Oklahoma, and then as an active Langston University alum. They taught me so much of the history that I was never taught in school. My first major writing was inspired by my grandfather talking about his neighborhood, Letroit Park, and how it was the center of Black intelligentsia in the mid 20th century. And in the 80s and the 90s, it was very much downtrodden and down on its luck, we should say. And I couldn't see it. And so I actually wrote a paper about the history of preservation for Letroit Park and compared it to Georgetown. And that was for my undergrad. The work that I've done specifically to uncover different histories is directly tied to the stories that my family members told me and the things I never learned. So to be clear, I never wanted to be a preservationist. I never wanted to be a historian. I wanted to design. I wanted to be an architect. I wanted to influence space. But I learned about the ways in which these interests could come together through preservation. So today I look at my research, teaching, and practice commitments as an approach to interdisciplinarity. That is what I have as my background with the degrees that I received in my training, offering students opportunities in applied learning in every place that I've taught, whether it be in a school of architecture, an art history department, or an American studies department. I've always brought an opportunity for curation, public history to my students so that they can understand what it means to be sharing history in spaces. And also bringing a serious commitment to issues of equity and justice through storytelling and through public interpretation of the past. So the ways that I do that in my practice, as an academic, you have to research, it's publish or perish. I have written a number of articles, book chapters, essays on African-American Afro-diasporic cultural heritage, urbanism in New Orleans, where I used to live, school design, urban renewal and preservation policy. I actually have a book coming out in March called Model Schools in the Model City, Race, Planning, and Education in the Nation's Capital. This is an image of the second iteration of Shaw Junior High School here in Washington, D.C. As far as practice goes, I've been able to take my love of creativity into curation and also as an advisor to public art works interpreting the past. On the left, you see a piece by Wendy Red Star as part of the Monument Lab pulling together exhibition. I was part of the curatorial advisory board for that installation on the National Mall. I helped produce a documentary on Berry Farm in Washington, D.C. It is available for free to stream online. So Berry Farm Community Land and Justice in D.C., which was an advocacy tool for people who wanted to save their homes in Southeast DC, and also leads seminars, public seminars on best practices for historic preservation. So through research, interpretation, programming, grant writing, advising, and guiding policy, those are all different ways that I've worked within the preservation field. Today, I am actually in my third week at the University of Oklahoma, taking up a new role as the Wick, Cary director of the Institute for Quality Communities. We work in cities and towns across the state of Oklahoma to improve quality of life through the built environment. This is actually an image from a week ago today, my first meeting with my graduate students in our office. And it is a joy and pleasure to be able to work with young people and help them think about the future of the past, and also be able to partner with different communities and get the students engaged with the types of projects I've done as a professional, but also projects that are beyond my scope. So Jessie said something about always learning, and it's being in an academic environment is absolutely the place where you're always learning. And I enjoy learning from my students as much as I enjoy teaching them. And so I'll just wrap up and say, I find it fascinating that Jessie, Tyriq, and I all have different degrees. We work in different areas of preservation. And, I was asking myself this question yesterday, like, is preservation a vocation or a profession? And even just seeing the wide range of opportunities that you have to engage just through this PowerPoint or this panel, I still haven't come to a conclusion, but that's what we're here for. And that's why we're sharing our experiences. So thank you for your time and for having me.
Thanks, Amber. I actually think it's both of those things and also a passion. I don't know. All the people that I've met through the ACHP, they all have this burning passion. So it's really a love that drives them. The love for history, the love for keep telling the full story of American history. So it's really, I feel passionate about it and always have since I was a child. So this is my dream job. But that's another story. So if all the panelists could come on the screen. We do have some questions, and I'd like to start us off. Thank you, Jessie. Tyriq, if you could come on. Um, with Al Tonetti. Now, Al, you have a couple of questions. I'm going to give you the ability to talk. So, Al, if you could unmute and ask away.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So my question for Jessie is those of us who are not Indigenous people, what role can we play in preserving Indigenous heritage places, especially when, at least in my area, we have no resident Indigenous communities, no federally recognized tribes in preserving these historic places? Do we only consult with federally recognized tribes who are not constituents, or do we consult with local people who say they are Indigenous people and are constituents when the people who are decision makers are basically listening to their voters and not outsiders, meaning tribes who are located outside their community? And I don't mean to, I'm posing this as a hypothetical, because I think if anybody knows who I am, they know how I feel about this, and I'm very involved in these matters. But Jessie, I just want to pose this, to give the people who are in attendance some general idea of, routes to follow or best practices. Let's put it that way. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. And, I will say it's a complicated question without understanding a little bit more, but I'll do my best. And then we can talk offline if you want to share some more of the specifics. But I would think, generally speaking, I can kind of address the federally recognized tribes question first. So, there are a number of states that have state recognized tribes, and under state law, they have rights to kind of weigh in on various things. So that would be one of the questions that I would have. But there are also tribes that just have not gained federal recognition at this point, and doesn't mean that they don't have a voice or need to be heard on some of these issues. Now, what weight that has on the legal side for the decision makers is a different question. But I think if you're in a situation where there are sites that there are concerns about, I think engaging with federally recognized tribes that surround that area, because it doesn't necessarily need to be within their reservation or kind of like adjacent. Sometimes those areas of interest can span a lot larger than people realize. And it all depends on the tribe and their history, how they moved, at least back in the Pacific Northwest. My tribe moved up and down the coast and then into the inner parts of Eastern Oregon and then down into California. So there are areas of interest there that even though you think about my tribe being, in the southern coast of Oregon, there are a lot more areas that they may want to weigh in on. So, I think kind of expanding the scope and talking to federally recognized tribes that are around there, or if they were moved at any point, there is potential that there are, 1,000 miles between the site and where the tribe is, that they actually may have some interest in those areas.
Okay.
And then I think, I know that when I was looking through the questions, and so, I think that there are, I think part of your question had to do with kind of like how to be an ally with tribes and how to kind of work through that. And I think that there are so many different ways that people who feel passionately about it and want to help with this can work collectively with the tribes to help push that forward. So I know someone had asked about a book, like books that I would recommend, but I always like to show this one, which is one of my favorites. This is an old, the first handbook on federal Indian law, and this is done by Felix Cohen. And Felix Cohen wasn't Indian, but this is like the Indian law Bible. And his work and the passion that he had to put into this really allowed for the leaders back in the early, 1900s to be able to make a lot of the arguments that make federal Indian law so strong today. So I think there are ways of doing that. But my advice, of course, would be always to come at it with an open heart and understanding that, there will be a lot of listening and trying to understand like what the needs of the community are, what they're hearing. I'll even say from my own perspective, if I'm talking to a group of want to presume that I understand what your issues are or that I have the answers. So I usually just stand there and like get questions like, hey, what are your concerns? Where do you think I got things wrong? How do you think that I can improve? What are the concerns that you have so I can actually think through those issues? Because I may think I have a lot of really like great ideas, but it may not be what's actually on the ground and what people need.
Lynn, am I still unmuted?
Yes, you are.
Okay. I very much appreciate your reply, Jessie. And I agree. And the thing that I would say most is that, yes, it is a complex and complicated issue because where I am, there are 45 federally recognized tribes with historical connections to where I am. And I can tell you that if I go to a decision maker and say to that person, there are 45 federally recognized tribes you need to discuss this with, that isn't going to go over too well. But that's just the reality of the situation. Doesn't mean you don't try, but it is very complex and complicated. So thank you, Jessie.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, happy to talk offline if you want to kind of like toss some ideas around later.
Thank
you. And panelists, if you feel comfortable giving out your email or phone number or any contact information, please share that in the chat. Make sure it's clicked to everyone so everyone gets it. I am going to move on and try to give the other panelists chances to answer some questions. So I want to call on Jordan Klein. Jordan, you had your question in the Q&A. Would you like to ask your question live?
Sure. And can everyone hear me? That's the age-old question.
Yes.
Oh, great. All right. First, just wanted to thank everyone so much for being on this panel and for their time. So my question is for folks who are in a career transition, understanding that, there are a lot of times economic barriers, privilege, and, just barriers to education and that kind of thing. If you're interested and you're kind of you have experience in a prior field, what are some of your, I would say like best practices or any tips, including internships, any entry-level jobs, networks or associations to join, that kind of thing, in addition to conducting informational interviews, just, what's the, kind of a scrappy way that folks could get into this field, maybe not necessarily with going back to school right away. And thank you.
Who'd like to take that? I'm sure you each have
I'm happy just
some
to
ideas.
give one quick line, which is be passionate. I will tell you that the students that I've worked with and the jobs that I've got, most of the time they go, we just love your passion. And we think you're going to show up and you're going to work hard to do it. So even if it's different than what you're doing right now, be passionate, speak from your heart. I think a lot of us, so at least I'll only speak for myself, think that you have to kind of fit into these boxes for jobs. And I have seen quite the opposite. Like, folks want to hire people that want to show up, that want to be there, that believe in the work that they're doing. And the more that they see that you are passionate about it, the more likely it is that they are going to select you to be a part of their team.
All right. Oh, go ahead, Amber.
Go ahead, Tyriq. Tyriq.
Yes. So within Baltimore City, there's community organizations and for every single neighborhood almost. So I would say start at your local level, get involved at the community scale, see what is going on at the local level, get involved with those initiatives, because a lot of them are volunteer workers. A lot of those people who are part of those community organizations volunteer their services, but as Jessie said, they're very passionate. So that would be a start to get into the preservation field. A lot of the nonprofit organizations go after grant funding in order to hire employees, and there's sometimes a lot of turnover. So I would say also look into nonprofit organizations to see if there's any opportunities available there. So for example, the Southwest Partnership in Baltimore is really good at hiring people, and they don't need a lot of experience to get started. So just bring your passion. You should be able to find something that you're passionate about, and
So it's actually difficult for me to answer this question because a master's degree, which is generally the entryway into the field, is expensive. Master's degrees are expensive. They're ridiculous. And I don't even necessarily want to say that, you should intern unless it's a paid internship. Like, it is very cost prohibitive. It's an issue. Places to look, I think my fellow panelists gave some really great advice. The local level was absolutely where you can find, yes, volunteer opportunities, or even just showing up and having your face in the place. When I was at the University of Pennsylvania, I was working with the Center for the Preservation of Civil Rights Sites, and we had convenings in Philadelphia where cultural heritage stewards, who were primarily volunteer, and a lot of them were elders, came and learned about the basics of preservation through different workshops and programming that we offered. So there is free programming that can be offered through your state historic preservation office or other local organizations that could at least get you in the networking with the folks who make decisions about hiring. I'll also throw out a Facebook group that I think is really wonderful, although they're currently trying to determine what their next steps are as a group, which is the Historic Preservation Professionals group. A lot of people can post in there, sometimes anonymously, and ask questions, and have this wide range of professionals who also have a wide range of opinions give them feedback. And that's for free 99. And so that's really useful too.
Thank you. I wanted to call on Amala, who posed this question, because this is an interesting one, but it looks like she's jumped off. She said her school has recently gotten rid of its historic preservation certificate program, which she wanted to pursue. What avenues would you recommend to help supplement that deficit? Anybody?
I would certainly go back to the free programming offered in different, local advocacy groups, and the state and federal groups. Certainly, there's a lot of training that could be had there. It's a shame that they got rid of the certification. A lot of people, when I was pursuing my master's in architectural history, weren't sure if that would be helpful for me. I did get the certificate in historic preservation. I got that thing frame too. So Amala said she's still here. People are like, it's just a certificate. That means you took 3 classes or whatever. And I'm like, I took those classes. Therefore, yeah, this frame, and so people actually, depending on who you speak to in the field, they may or may not even take your certificate seriously. I took mine seriously, but it really is about taking advantage of a plethora of opportunities for self-education that are free.
Those are very good points. My only thing that I have to mention is stay involved. The State Department and Housing and Community Development organization offers like monthly webinars that you can tune into that will give you valuable information on preservation and its practices, and things that are changing at the state or federal level. So I would say try to join as many webinars as possible. There's a lot of information that is given out at those webinars and those information sessions. I tune in all the time to expand my knowledge on preservation because you can't know it all. So mention it.
Thanks, Tyriq. We do have a couple of questions. They seem very quick. Allison posed this question. I'll ask both of them because they're similar. What advice would you offer to those looking to shift their existing career into historic preservation? And are there any resources you can recommend to find jobs in heritage preservation? Now, for that one, I can take the ACHP actually has a web page where we pool all of those resources. So I'm going to ask my colleagues, either Patricia or Shayla, to put that link to our workforce development page in the chat. So anybody else on shifting their existing career, or if you have any resources, I know that Tyriq just mentioned some.
I think for anybody who may be looking for work in like the tribal realm, so there is a website called Turtle Talk. I think it's a WordPress website, and it's mostly a legal blog, but they do post jobs that are not just legal on there. And so there are internship opportunities. And so I think Fridays are the dates that they usually put up the jobs. So you can just have like a reminder to go on there and kind of see jobs that are available. And there are a fair amount of preservation jobs that are available across the country working for tribes directly. So those could be like internships or externships or like actual positions. So that I think that would be if you're looking for something tribal specific.
Okay, anything else? Because we have a few more questions. Shall I move on? Or Amber,
I'll
you've got
just say
something?
that, I have looked at the National Council of Public History, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. What other places? I'm just like racking my brain for places that have opportunities that are often posted. And sometimes, again, preservation, Lynn has told us, is a vocation and a profession. It's a wide range. And so even the notion of public history and public interpretation and community engagement, like those, there could be jobs that don't have the word preservation listed in them and still do some of the work that you all might be interested in. So I think even racking your brain to figure out what it is specifically that you want to do. I do call myself a preservationist, but I also call myself a public historian. I do say that I do research, but I also say I do public interpretation. And so, thinking about even how you word what it is that you're interested in, that will allow you to expand the opportunities and possibilities when you're looking for a job or transition.
Well,
Yeah.
Tabitha actually has has a good question. Tabitha, would you like to come on and ask it?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. I'm an undergrad now, and I've asked my professors what skills I should be entering the workforce with. They recommended grant writing. Is there anything else I should be on the lookout for opportunities to learn?
Grant writing is huge. I had to learn that on the job. Grant writing is huge, and you will continue to learn because there are federal grants and there's state grants and there's nonprofit and private foundations. So I would just reiterate that whatever you've learned thus far is great, and whatever you can do to keep developing those skills is really important. Program management, or project management, actually, I would also say is a really important skill that I've also had to learn on the job. When you're a professor, they don't teach you project management skills. They teach you how to write a syllabus, if they do that. And so figuring out, what a timeline is that you're working on, what your deliverables are, how to balance a budget, how to make sure that you're completing projects within a certain timeline and within budget, like project management, I think is super important. It's something that I actually am interested in getting more training on, like looking for online opportunities as well.
And Ben just asked a question in the chat which speaks to this. He asked if you could recommend any certificate and or training programs or workshops that last about Section 106, the Section 106 process. So that would be a skill that I would highly recommend. And the ACHP is actually, we just put up our list of trainings that are available, Section 106 trainings for 2025. So if Shale or Patricia could put that link to the trainings in the chat, that is something that you could utilize. And it's invaluable to know that. I know that Tyriq, as an architect, how valuable is knowing Section 106, because you go into an architectural firm, right? And a lot of architects their projects might involve Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, for any of you who don't know. Can you tell us if you've come in contact with that as an architect?
Yes, one of our commissioners, Catherine Good, is actually a historic preservation architect for her firm, Marshall Graves Architects. So she is very instrumental. She's the project lead for all of the firm's historic preservation projects. So she facilitates everything. She contacts the city. She does the applications, which are required as well. So you'll be an excellent resource to any business, firm, or company that you choose to work with. Even if it's grant writing, that's very important, no matter, even for the city. We hire grant writers all the time because we need these resources. So you may not specifically be working under a preservation umbrella, but you may be working in a historic city as a grant writer, and that's still doing, the equal amount of work as a historic preservationist. So a lot of architecture firms, they actually shy away from historic projects because they have no knowledge about the process or Section 106 process. So any training that you could bring to these entities will be instrumental for yourself and for them. And you would actually elevate yourself to having a leadership role within those spaces. So yeah, that's a good point.
I can't believe we're down to our last 4 minutes. I wanted to get Brian's question in there. Brian, do you want to come on and ask Brian Crumley, come on and ask that question?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So, and I guess my question may be a little deeper than what was asked in my question. But so I'm a practicing architect and I work on a lot of historic preservation and adaptive reuse projects. So, and I'm interested in advocating more for historic preservation, or I guess even more importantly, like DHR and National Park Service can make it difficult to preserve historic buildings with limiting certain things that can be done. So I guess, my ultimate goal would be to advocate more for making it easier to preserve historic buildings. Any thoughts?
I would say, oh, I'm sorry, Amber.
I was gonna say I saw Jessie on mute, so I didn't know if you had. You're good.
I wanted to say that Preservation Action has an annual conference. I think it's coming up in March. That's a great way to get involved. They actually include, we're not an advocacy agency, we're a federal regulatory agency, but I would check out their website. They have their annual Preservation Action Advocacy Week that is coming up in March. So you might want to check that out. It's here in Washington, D.C., so I don't know if that's anywhere near where you could attend, but yeah, check out their website and find out more about that.
Thank you.
And there's also the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions. So there are preservation commissions all over the nation, and they do some advocacy too. So you might have so maybe check out the NAPC website and see if there's a preservation commission near you that you could get involved with.
And, Brian, I'll say that a lot of what I've done beyond like public interpretation has been about understanding policy. When I was on the National Park Service National Historic Landmark Committee, we reviewed federal policy for National Historic Landmarks. I think, and I'm not a lawyer, okay, there's a difference between law and policy. And oftentimes I feel like in our field, not even I feel like, I know in our field, people take policy and act like it's the law when it's not. Or people will create some sort of procedure that they do or some sort of policy and be like, well, that's just what we do. I have lived in this space where I actually look at the law and say, well, even though this is what you do or what you have done for the last 40 years, the law doesn't say that, I'll just give you an example that's not necessarily about breaking down the silos of what can and can't be done with preservation, but what can and can't qualify as a historic structure, is this notion of integrity and how I primarily deal with Black historic resources that live in areas that have been underfinanced or under-resourced. And, oftentimes I get the pushback, well, it lacks significant integrity. And then I have to look at the 7 criteria of integrity and go, well, these are the 7 criteria. You're only looking at these 3. And like, it is an argument to be made because people will try to go the easiest route and they don't want to really push beyond what they're used to doing for expediency's sake. And sometimes you have to be like, actually, no, that's not what the law says or like how this is supposed to be applied at all. So, I mean, that takes a deeper understanding of those rules, but people have been getting away with this stuff for decades.
Well, thank you. I just want to let you know that we're at time. It has just been a wonderful discussion. I'm sure we could have gone on and on. Sorry if we didn't get to all the questions. I just put my email into the chat. So anybody who we didn't get to your question, if you want to send it to me, I'll make sure it gets answered and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. And I want to thank Amber, Tyriq, and Jessie for your time. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I just want to thank everyone who attended for being here. Please join us again for the rest of our webinars in this series. We've got 4 more in the coming months. And we had put the link to the page where you can click on the webinars and get to the registration page for each of them. So we hope to see you all then. Also, when you leave the webinar, please take a moment to fill out our survey. We do read through them and actually base our next year's webinar series on your feedback. So it's invaluable to us. So we really appreciate it. And I just want to say, of course, I got to plug away the ACHP's social media. Please follow us on all our social media channels and on YouTube. And we hope to see you in February for our next webinar. Bye, everyone.